The desert is silent now. Wind moves through broken stone and over stretches of pale sand where almost nothing survives for long. Yet beneath that silence, near an old bend of the Nile in what is now northern Sudan, archaeologists uncover something deeply unsettling. Skeleton after skeleton emerges from the ground, some curled carefully into burial positions, others shattered by injuries that never healed. Tiny stone blades remain lodged inside ribs and hips. Arrow points lie buried beside bones that have been dead for more than 13,000 years. Several bodies belong to children. Many show signs not of one sudden attack, but of repeated violence over time. The dead were buried with care, but they carried war into the grave. Long before kingdoms, before bronze swords, before walls, banners, generals, or written history, human beings were already killing one another in organised ways. That possibility changes the shape of the ancient world. It forces the past into a darker light. The common image of prehistoric people living in simple harmony with nature becomes difficult to maintain when confronted with a cemetery like this one. The site is known today as Jebel Sahaba, and for decades scholars have argued over what exactly happened there. Some believe it may preserve evidence of the earliest known war fought by humans. Others caution that the truth is less clear, that the violence may have unfolded gradually through raids and ambushes across generations. The evidence remains incomplete, but whatever took place beside the Nile at the end of the Ice Age was severe enough to leave entire communities scarred by fear, injury, and death. The strange thing is how ordinary the people themselves appear at first glance. They are not primitive caricatures from some distant fantasy of prehistory. Their hands look like modern hands. Their faces, reconstructed from bone, could pass unnoticed in a crowded street. They laugh, age, mourn, raise children, carry water, sharpen tools, and bury their dead with rituals that already feel recognisably human. And somewhere in that familiar humanity lies the beginning of organised conflict. The Nile Valley at this time is nothing like the harsh desert visible today. The world is emerging slowly from the grip of the last ice age. Vast glaciers still linger across northern regions of the planet, but climates are shifting rapidly. Rainfall patterns swing unpredictably, rivers expand and shrink, grasslands appear where barren ground once dominated, only to retreat again. Human populations move constantly through these unstable landscapes, following animals, fish, edible plants. And water? Survival depends on adaptation. A few seasons of drought or failed migration routes can destroy an entire community. Along the Nile, water becomes everything. In a drying world, the river acts like a long artery of life cutting through increasingly hostile land. Fish crowd its channels, birds gather in wetlands, herd animals come to drink along its banks. Human groups cluster near dependable stretches of water because they have little choice, and when people are pushed together under pressure, tension follows close behind. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. For most of human existence, there are no written records to explain motives or fears. Archaeology deals instead in fragments, a cut mark on bone, charcoal buried beneath ancient soil, pollen trapped in sediment layers, the angle of a broken skull. Researchers build narratives from traces left accidentally behind by people who never imagined they would be studied thousands of years later. At Jebel Sahaba, the traces are unusually grim. The cemetery is first excavated in the 1960s during the UNESCO campaign to save archaeological sites threatened by the construction of the Aswan High Dam. Much of ancient Nubia is about to disappear beneath the waters of Lake Nasser. Archaeologists rush to recover whatever they can before entire landscapes vanish forever underwater. Among the discoveries is a cluster of burials dating to roughly 13,000 years ago, near the boundary between the late Pleistocene and the beginning of the modern climatic era. Even at the time, the site stands out. Nearly half the skeletons display clear signs of violent trauma. Some injuries are healed, meaning the victim survived earlier attacks before eventually dying later. Others are fresh and lethal. Stone fragments embedded in bodies suggest projectile weapons, likely arrows or spears tipped with tiny sharpened blades called microliths. Several individuals appear to have been struck multiple times. One skeleton contains more than 20 lesions consistent with projectiles or stab wounds. Another shows crushing injuries that may have come from close combat. Children are not spared. Women are not spared. This does not resemble a duel between hunters or an isolated murder. What survives in the record suggests sustained violence directed at entire groups. And yet uncertainty shadows every conclusion. Scholars still debate whether Jebel Sahaba represents one catastrophic massacre or a cemetery accumulating victims over many separate conflicts. The distinction matters. A single massacre implies sudden destruction. Repeated burials imply something potentially more familiar and perhaps more disturbing cycles of revenge, territorial hostility, and recurring raids unfolding over years or decades. Not chaos, but pattern. Not random brutality. But organised hostility between communities. That possibility pushes the origins of warfare far deeper into the human story than many once believed possible. For a long time, historians and anthropologists often connected warfare to agriculture and permanent settlement. The logic seems straightforward. Farming creates surplus food, fixed land ownership, hierarchy, wealth, borders, and eventually states. Once people possess fields, granaries, and livestock, they have something worth stealing or defending. War follows naturally from property and inequality. Hunter-gatherers, by contrast, were often imagined as smaller, more mobile, and less burdened by territorial ambition. But sites like Jebel Sahaba complicate that picture. These people are not farmers. Cities do not yet exist. There are no kings commanding armies. No fortresses rise above the Nile. And still, the dead arrive carrying weapons inside their bones. Perhaps this should not surprise us as much as it does. Human beings evolved in environments defined by competition. Groups protected hunting grounds, water sources, migration routes, and social alliances. Trust rarely extended far beyond kinship networks. Encounters with strangers could bring exchange and marriage, but they could also bring danger. In periods of environmental stress, even small disputes might spiral into lethal violence. No written witness survives to explain what sparked the bloodshed near Jebel Sahaba. Hunger may have played a role. Fear may have played a role. Territorial pressure, revenge, or mistrust between neighbouring groups may all have contributed. No single explanation fully accounts for this ancient violence. What makes the site so haunting is not simply the brutality itself, but the sense of recognition it creates. The injuries look painfully familiar. Projectile wounds, defensive fractures, evidence of repeated attacks. The same patterns appear across much later battlefields separated by thousands of years. Technology changes, scale changes. Human behaviour often does not. The people buried here stand near the threshold between two worlds. Behind them lies the immense prehistoric expanse of Ice Age humanity. Ahead lies the rise of villages, agriculture, kingdoms, empires, and organised military states. Yet already, at this early point, traces of collective violence emerge with startling clarity. The First War may not have begun with civilization. It may have begun long before civilization existed at all. And all of it starts beside a river cutting through a dying world. Beyond the river, the world is changing in ways no person can measure. Though every living body feels the pressure, the air shifts, the rains hesitate. Herds alter their routes across open ground. Lakes swell, shrink, and sometimes vanish into cracked basins. For generations, people have known the land through memory, where fish gather after floods, where stone for blades can be found, where edible roots appear after the wet season, where animals pass when the year begins to turn. But at the end of the Ice Age, memory itself becomes less reliable. The old patterns still exist, yet they no longer hold as firmly as before. This is the late Pleistocene, a time when the planet is stepping unevenly out of a colder age. Great ice sheets still grip northern lands, locking away immense volumes of water. Sea levels remain far lower than today. Coastlines lie far beyond their modern edges. Land bridges connect regions now separated by water. Across Africa, the environment is not one stable background but a shifting mosaic of grassland, desert, woodland, marsh, and river corridor. Some areas become greener, others dry. Some regions change slowly enough for people to adapt. Others transform within a few generations, perhaps even within a lifetime. The Nile is central to this story because the river offers continuity in an unstable world. It flows north through regions where rainfall may fail for long stretches, bringing water from distant highlands beyond the immediate horizon of the people living along its banks. To those communities, the Nile is not merely a river, it is movement, food, boundary, danger, and promise. It is a road for fish and birds, it is a line of trees and reeds through open land, it is a magnet drawing animals. And therefore drawing hunters, it is also a narrow ribbon where too many needs can converge. The people living in this world are highly skilled foragers. They read tracks in mud, watch seasonal birds, cut reeds, gather wild grains, trap fish, and make delicate stone tools small enough to be fitted into composite weapons. They do not simply wander aimlessly. Their movements are structured by knowledge accumulated over generations. They understand where to return and when. They know which places are safe and which are risky. They carry stories about waterholes, dangerous animals, neighbouring groups, and perhaps places where ancestors lie buried. What survives in the record is only the material edge of this knowledge, but it points toward lives far more complex than old stereotypes of hunter-gatherers allow. One surprising detail from this period is how advanced small stone tool technology becomes. The tiny blades found across many late Pleistocene sites are not crude scraps. They are carefully shaped microliths, often designed to be set into shafts, handles, or barbed points. A single weapon may combine wood, fibre, resin, bone, and stone in a way that leaves only the stone behind for archaeologists to find. The organic parts decay, the engineering disappears. The surviving flake can look modest in a museum drawer, but in life it may have been part of a fast, accurate, deadly projectile. This matters because the same technologies that make hunting more effective can also make human conflict more dangerous. A thrown spear requires closeness and strength. A bow or light projectile can strike from farther away. It can wound someone before they know exactly where the attacker stands. It can be used from cover. It can turn an encounter at the edge of a camp, a fishing ground, or a crossing point into sudden panic. Scholars still debate the exact forms of weaponry used at Jebel Sahaba, but the embedded stone fragments and wound patterns point toward projectile violence as a major part of the story. Yet weapons alone do not create war. They become part of war only when social conditions make violence repeatable. At the end of the Ice Age, those conditions may have been growing more common. Climatic instability can compress populations into favourable zones. If dry areas expand away from the river, then the river's banks become more important. If fish runs fail in one stretch, groups may push into another. If herds shift their routes, Hunters may follow them into territories already used by others. No one needs a king or a flag for conflict to emerge. A contested fishing place can be enough, a dead relative can be enough, a season of hunger can be enough. The Nile itself is not gentle. Its floodwaters can nourish, but they can also destroy camps and erase familiar ground. Channels migrate, marshes expand and contract, islands appear and disappear, sand and silt cover old surfaces. In some years, the river may offer abundance. In others, it may concentrate life too tightly along limited banks. People living here must balance opportunity with danger. Crocodiles haunt the water. Hippos can wreck boats or bodies with terrifying force. Insects, disease, heat, and flood all form part of daily survival. Human enemies, if present, are only one danger among many, but they are a danger with memory and intention. Across this changing landscape, small communities likely maintain networks of contact. They may exchange stone, shells, marriage partners, or information. They may share ceremonies or burial traditions across distances. Archaeology often reveals connection long before it reveals conflict, but connection does not guarantee peace. Neighbouring groups can know each other well and still become enemies. In fact, long familiarity can sharpen disputes. People who meet repeatedly at seasonal gathering places may also accumulate grievances: a theft, an injury, a killing, a marriage refused, a hunting territory crossed too often. The evidence remains incomplete, but violence in small-scale societies often grows from relationships, not from total strangeness. This is why the world before Jebel Sahaba should not be imagined as empty wilderness, with a few isolated bands drifting peacefully through it. It is a lived-in world, patterned by roots, rites, memories, and expectations. Certain patches of land matter, certain stretches of river matter, certain dead matter. The living carry obligations to them. Even without written law, there are rules. Even without states, there are boundaries. Even without armies, there can be organised killing. So when the bodies at Jebel Sahaba enter the ground, they do not come from nowhere. They come from a landscape already under strain, from communities already skilled in both survival and danger, from a river valley where life is rich enough to attract people and narrow enough to force encounters. The first war, if that is what this was, does not begin with a throne room or a command. It begins with climate, hunger, memory, weapons, and the uneasy closeness of human groups trying to remain alive beside the same water. Along the water's edge, life gathers in layers. Reeds stand thick in the shallows, bending under the weight of birds. Fish move through channels that glimmer in the changing light. Mud preserves the prints of antelope, hippo, crocodile, and human feet before the river softens them again. The people who live here know the banks not as scenery, but as a map of hunger and opportunity. Every bend has a use. Every patch of high ground may become shelter. Every season brings a different arrangement of animals, plants, water, insects, and risk. The Nile Valley communities of this deep past are not city dwellers, not villagers in the later farming sense, and not rootless wanderers either. They likely move through a familiar territory, returning to places where stone can be gathered, where fish are abundant, where wild plants ripen, and where the dead may be buried. Their world is mobile but not random. A group may camp near the river during periods of abundance, then move outward when conditions allow. Following game or gathering seasonal foods, in harsher stretches, the river pulls them back again. What survives in the record suggests people who combine flexibility with attachment, a way of life that depends on movement, but still gives certain places enduring meaning. Food is varied, and that variety matters. Fish are likely central, because river systems provide dependable protein when hunting is uncertain. People may use nets, traps, spears, lines, or basketry devices that leave almost no trace after thousands of years. They gather aquatic plants, seeds, tubers, fruits, and grasses. They hunt antelope and other mammals drawn toward water. Birds and eggs may supplement the diet. Grinding stones found in some late Pleistocene contexts hint that wild plant foods are not marginal snacks, but important resources requiring labour and planning. Long before agriculture, humans are already experts at processing landscapes into meals. This is one of the lesser-known details that changes how the period feels. The people at the edge of the Nile may already be intensively using wild grains and plants, not because they are farmers, but because they understand seasonal abundance deeply. They can harvest, grind, store briefly, carry, and cook. Their meals may involve roasted fish, pounded seeds, roots softened in fire, marrow cracked from bones, and shellfish gathered from wet places. The line between foraging and later farming is not a sudden leap from ignorance to invention. It is a long familiarity with edible life, sharpened by necessity. Their tools reflect the same intelligence. Stone blades are made with precision, but stone is only part of the toolkit. Wood, bone, sinew, leather, plant fibre, resin, and shell likely surround every camp. A finished object may be a composite thing, a weapon or tool assembled from several materials and maintained over time. A broken microlith can be replaced, a shaft can be repaired, a hide can be scraped, softened, and wrapped. The archaeological record favours stone because stone endures. But daily life is full of perishable materials now lost to decay. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness can make ancient lives look poorer than they were. Around the camp, labour is constant. Fires must be kept or remade. Children must be watched near dangerous water. Fish must be cleaned before they rot. Tools must be sharpened. Hides must be prepared, bodies must be protected from heat, insects, and predators. The old and injured may carry knowledge even when they cannot travel easily. The young learn by watching. They learn which plants are safe, which stones fracture cleanly, which clouds promise rain, which tracks mean fresh danger. They also learn who belongs and who does not. Belonging is one of the invisible forces in this story. Archaeology can uncover bones and tools, but it struggles to recover the emotional boundaries that divide one group from another. Yet those boundaries surely exist. People know their kin, their allies, their marriage partners, their rivals. They recognise styles of tools, ornaments, body decoration, scarification, language, gesture, and ritual. A stranger approaching the wrong camp may not simply be an unknown person. He may be a threat. A messenger, a potential spouse, a thief, a survivor seeking refuge, or the relative of someone killed months earlier. The same encounter can hold many possibilities at once. Burial practices offer one of the clearest signs that these communities attach meaning to place and person. At Jebel Sahaba and related sites, bodies are not discarded casually. They are placed in graves. Some are positioned carefully. This care matters because many of the dead suffered violence. Even if they died in attacks, someone recovered them, carried them, arranged them, and covered them. That act suggests grief, obligation, and perhaps memory. The dead are not merely biological remains. They become part of the landscape's human history. Children in such a world grow up quickly, but not without tenderness. The presence of young victims at violent sites is often described clinically, yet it is among the most devastating pieces of evidence. A child struck by a projectile is not a warrior. A child buried among adults belongs to a community whose conflict has reached beyond combatants. Whether this reflects massacre, raiding, or repeated attacks, it shows that the violence touches the vulnerable. No single explanation fully accounts for why children died there, but their presence makes it difficult to imagine the events as limited. Formal combat between selected fighters. At the same time, the people of the Nile are not living in constant terror every moment of their lives. Long stretches are likely ordinary in the deepest human sense. Someone wakes before others and feeds a fire. Someone repairs a net. Someone jokes dryly after dropping a fish back into the water, because even in prehistory embarrassment probably exists. Someone watches the river rise and knows whether the season will be kind. The danger matters precisely because it interrupts lives that are otherwise filled with routine, skill, patience, and social bonds. This balance between ordinary life and hidden threat is essential. If Jebel Sahaba records early warfare, then war does not emerge among monsters. It emerges among people who love their children, tend their dead, know the river's moods, and depend on one another for survival. The same hands that shape a blade for hunting can prepare food, hold an infant, or dig a grave. The same group that gathers by the water in trust may later stand watch against another group approaching through reeds. By the time the wounded bodies begin to accumulate in the cemetery, the Nile Valley has already become more than an ecological refuge. It is a social world dense with memory. Routes cross, camps recur, graves mark the ground, resources draw people close. The river gives life, but it also narrows choice. And where choice narrows, old tensions can harden into something more organised, more repeated, and more deadly than a single violent moment. The cemetery appears not as a monument, but as a wound in the ground. When archaeologists reach it in the 20th century, they are not searching for the first war. They are working under pressure, racing against a modern flood. The Aswan High Dam is rising far to the north, and with it comes a new lake that will swallow valleys, settlements, temples, rock art, graves, and entire archaeological landscapes. The rescue campaign across Nubia is one of the great salvage operations of archaeology. Driven by urgency and loss, the irony is difficult to ignore. A modern engineering project built to control the Nile threatens to erase some of the oldest evidence of human life along that same river. Jebel Sahaba lies in this endangered zone, near the modern borderlands of Egypt and Sudan, in a landscape that once held far more than bare desert. The site is sometimes called Cemetery 117, a name so plain it almost hides the horror of what was found there. Excavators uncover a cluster of late Pleistocene burials, more than 50 individuals in total, dating to roughly 13,000 years ago, though exact dating and interpretation have been refined and debated over time. The number is small compared with later battlefields, but for a mobile hunter-gatherer community, it is enormous. These are not anonymous statistics from a kingdom's frontier war. They may represent a substantial portion of a living social group. At first, the graves show care, bodies are laid out, some are flexed, some are buried with traces of red ochre or associated artifacts, depending on the burial context. There is nothing about the cemetery's surface that announces violence, but bones remember what soil conceals. As the skeletons are studied, injuries begin to multiply. Skulls show fractures, arms and hands show damage, ribs, pelvises, vertebrae, and limbs contain marks consistent with penetrating weapons. Tiny stone fragments appear near or within the bodies, sometimes in positions that strongly suggest they entered flesh before burial, rather than simply falling into graves by chance. The dead are not merely old, many are violently old. Early interpretations are dramatic. Jebel Sahaba is described as evidence of a massacre, perhaps one of the earliest known episodes of organised warfare. The image is powerful, a community attacked, killed, and buried after a single devastating event. It fits the emotional force of the site. But archaeology rarely allows such clean certainty. Later reanalysis complicates the picture. Some injuries appear healed, some bodies show multiple episodes of trauma. Some stone fragments may relate to earlier wounds, not only death blows. This suggests not one simple slaughter, but a longer history of violence in which people were wounded, survived, healed, were wounded again, and eventually died. That detail changes everything. A massacre is terrible but brief. Repeated injury implies enduring insecurity. It means people may have lived with the knowledge that attacks could come again. It means individuals carried old wounds while still fishing, gathering, travelling, and sleeping near the river. Healed fractures and embedded projectiles turn the cemetery into a record of lived violence, not only death. Scholars still debate how to read these patterns. But the possibility of recurring conflict is now central to the mystery. The microliths are among the most unsettling clues. They are small, sharp stone pieces, sometimes only a few centimetres long, easily overlooked by anyone expecting grand weapons. Yet their size is deceptive. Set into wooden shafts or hafted along barbed edges, such pieces can cut deeply, break off inside flesh, and remain there. Some fragments from Jebel Sahaba were found in locations associated with vital organs or major muscle groups. A projectile striking the torso might not kill instantly, especially if infection of blood loss or organ damage unfolds over hours or days. A person could flee, collapse later, or survive with a stone fragment lodged inside the body. The evidence remains incomplete because soft tissue is gone, but the bones and stone preserve enough to show that violence was intimate and efficient. There is also the distribution of the dead. Men, women, and children all appear among the victims. This matters because it weakens the idea of a formal battle between adult male fighters alone. It may point instead toward raids on camps, ambushes near water, attacks during movement, or episodes in which entire groups were targeted. Some individuals show wounds from behind or from angles that suggest they were not facing an opponent in a staged fight. Interpretations vary. And not every injury can be reconstructed confidently. But the overall pattern does not look like a neat contest. It looks messy, repeated, and socially broad. One lesser known and important point is that not all damage on ancient skeletons is easy to interpret. Bones can break after burial from pressure, erosion, excavation, or handling. Stone artifacts can move in soil, animal activity, sediment shifting, and later disturbance may confuse the scene. Good archaeology must constantly ask whether an injury happened before death, around the time of death, or long after burial. At Jebel Sahaba, many lesions do appear consistent with real trauma. But the process of separating violence from post-depositional damage is painstaking. The site's power does not remove the need for caution. Even the word cemetery can mislead. A cemetery implies stability, a place returned to repeatedly, a recognised ground for the dead. That may be true here, but it also raises questions. If the victims were killed in one attack, why were they all buried in this place if they died over many years? Why did survivors continue to use the same cemetery? The answer may lie in attachment to landscape. The burial ground itself could have been a marker of identity, a place where a group's dead anchored them to a contested riverbank. To bury someone there may have been an act of remembrance, but also an act of claim. The care of burial stands in sharp contrast to the violence of death. This contrast is one of the most human aspects of the site. Someone took bodies marked by projectiles and fractures and placed them into the earth. Someone handled the dead after fear had passed, or perhaps while fear still remained nearby. Someone chose not to abandon them. The presence of trauma does not erase tenderness. In fact, it makes tenderness more visible. Beneath the grand question of the First War lies a quieter fact: the survivors cared enough to bury their wounded dead. And still, the cemetery refuses to explain itself fully. It offers evidence, not confession. It gives stone points, broken bones, burial positions, patterns of injury, and dates from a world without writing. It does not tell us who attacked whom, what name they gave themselves, whether the conflict began over fish, territory, revenge, fear, or a death now lost to time. No single explanation fully accounts for this. But as the graves accumulate in the mind, a shape begins to emerge. This is not isolated anger. It is not one unlucky body in an otherwise peaceful landscape. It is a community repeatedly touched by lethal force. Jebel Sahaba does not prove that war began here in an absolute sense. Somewhere older may still wait undiscovered, or already lie destroyed beneath water, sand, or urban expansion. But it remains one of the earliest places where the archaeological record shows collective violence with unusual clarity. The cemetery is not just a collection of dead, it is a threshold. On one side are scattered hints of individual killing in prehistory. On the other is the long human history of raids, of feuds. Battles, fortresses, armies, and states. Jebel Sahaba stands near that threshold with stone still buried in bone. If Jebel Sahaba were only a scene of death, its meaning might be easier to contain. A terrible attack, a buried community, a single scar left in the earth. But the deeper the site is studied, the less it behaves like one frozen moment. It begins instead to resemble something more drawn out, more difficult to imagine, and perhaps more familiar in the long history of human violence. The bones do not simply say that people died violently. They suggest that some people had already been hurt before. They carried healed wounds, they survived earlier attacks. They lived long enough for bone to repair, only to enter the cemetery later with fresh injuries or other signs of trauma. The First War, if this is what the site preserves, may not have been a battle at all. It may have been a seasonless fear, This distinction sits at the centre of the debate. A single massacre is archaeologically dramatic because it creates a clear narrative. A group is attacked, many die, survivors bury them. The event becomes visible as a compressed tragedy. But repeated violence produces a different kind of record. Graves accumulate over time. Each burial may represent a separate episode: an ambush near reeds, a raid on a camp, a clash at a fishing ground, an attack during travel. A revenge killing after an earlier death. Individually, these incidents might look small. Together, they form a pattern of organised hostility. Scholars still debate where to draw the line between feud and war, but at Jebel Sahaba that line begins to blur. The original interpretation leans strongly toward massacre. The high proportion of injured individuals, the presence of embedded stone points, and the clustering of burials seem to point toward a catastrophic event. It was an understandable reading, especially in the 1960s, when the site emerged under the urgency of salvage excavation, and when prehistoric violence was often framed in broad, stark terms. Later researchers, using new methods and renewed examination of the remains, noticed more complexity. Many skeletons showed multiple lesions. Some injuries had healed. Some individuals appear to have suffered violence more than once. The cemetery no longer looked only like the aftermath of one attack. It began to look like the burial ground of a population living through recurring conflict. That possibility is chilling in a quieter way. It means people at the Nile's edge may have lived for years with the expectation of danger. A healed wound is a biography written in bone. It tells us that an individual was struck, survived pain, avoided immediate death, received enough care or had enough resilience to heal, and returned to life. That person may have walked with stiffness, carried a scar, lost strength in a limb, or remembered the attack whenever strangers appeared near the river. In a small community, everyone would know the story. The wound would not belong only to the body, it would belong to the group's memory. In such a world, revenge becomes possible, fear becomes inherited. Children grow up hearing where an uncle was struck, where a sister was killed, where a group from upstream was last seen. A practical warning can become a social boundary. Do not camp there. Do not cross at that bend. Do not trust those people. What survives in the record suggests violence, but it cannot preserve the words that carried violence forward. It cannot tell us whether these communities named enemies, sang grief, marked bodies after attacks, or taught children to recognise danger by tool style, accent, ornament, or route. The idea of repeated conflict also fits the environmental setting. Along a river corridor, groups may encounter each other season after season. They may not be total strangers. They may exchange at times and fight at others. A successful raid does not require permanent conquest. It can be enough to drive another group away from a rich fishing location for a few weeks, to avenge a death, to steal supplies, or to discourage access to a crossing. Small-scale violence can become cyclical precisely because no central authority exists to end it. There is no court, no king, no treaty archive, no border commission, which is probably just as well, since even later societies with all these inventions rarely become peaceful simply by writing things down. A single battle is often easier for modern minds to imagine because later, history teaches us to think in campaigns and decisive clashes. But pre-state violence often works differently. It may involve surprise, avoidance, ambush, pursuit, and withdrawal. People rarely line up in open ground if they can strike from cover. They may attack when opponents are vulnerable, when adults are away, when camps are scattered, when people sleep, when a group is crossing water or carrying food. This kind of conflict leaves archaeological traces that are hard to organise into neat events. It does not need a battlefield. Battlefield is the landscape itself. Jebel Sahaba's victims, spread across age and sex categories, seem more consistent with this broader violence than with formal combat between selected warriors. Women and children among the dead do not automatically prove massacre, but they do suggest that attacks reach domestic life, in repeated raids. Those who die are not necessarily those who choose to fight. They may be those caught at the wrong moment. Some adults may have tried to defend others. Some may have been struck while fleeing. Some injuries may reflect close contact, others projectiles from a distance. The evidence remains incomplete, but its social implication is hard to escape violence had entered the ordinary spaces of life. This does not mean the people of Jebel Sahaba were uniquely violent, or that human nature can be reduced to bloodshed. That would be too simple and too modern a temptation. The same cemetery that preserves wounds also preserves burial care. The same community that suffered violence maintains social bonds strong enough to recover and inter the dead. The real mystery is not whether humans are violent or peaceful, as though one word could summarize a species. The mystery is how people move between cooperation and hostility, how quickly a riverbank can become a refuge for some and a threat to others, and how environmental pressure can turn ordinary boundaries into lethal ones. There is also a problem of scale. The phrase First War sounds grand, but the people involved may have numbered in the dozens, not thousands. There may have been no permanent leaders, no professional fighters, no military planning in the later sense, yet for those who lived through it, scale would not lessen terror. A raid by 10 attackers against a camp of 20 can be world-ending. The death of a few adults can threaten food gathering, childcare, knowledge transmission, and future survival. In small societies, a handful of casualties is not a minor loss. It can reshape the entire community. This is why Jebel Sahaba matters beyond its age. It shows that organised violence does not require cities. It does not require metal. It does not require taxation. royal ambition, written propaganda, or borders carved onto maps. It requires groups capable of remembering injuries, coordinating action, identifying enemies, and using weapons with intent. Those capacities are deeply human, and they existed long before civilization sharpened them into armies. Still, caution remains essential. The site may record a massacre, it may record recurring raids, it may record both a long period of hostility ending in one devastating attack. Some injuries may be misread, some episodes may be invisible, and some deaths may have no connection to conflict at all. No single explanation fully accounts for every body in the cemetery. But the broad pattern is difficult to dismiss. Too many wounds, too many projectiles, too many victims across the community, too much evidence of survival after earlier trauma. So the mystery becomes less about whether violence occurred and more about what kind of violence it was. Not one battle, perhaps many. Not war as later kings would understand it, but war before the word war existed, recurring, remembered, socially organised killing between human groups under pressure, a long shadow falling across the Nile's edge, grave by grave, until the cemetery itself became the archive. The weapons of Jebel Sahaba do not look like the weapons of war in the way later history teaches us to imagine them. There are no swords darkened with age, no bronze spearheads laid beside a ruler, no shields painted with emblems, no chariots, no helmets, no metal at all. What remains are small pieces of stone, some so modest that they can seem almost harmless until their purpose becomes clear. They are flakes, points, backed blades, and microliths. The fragments of a technology built for lightness, sharpness, and replacement. In the hand, a single piece might look like debris. In a weapon, hafted into wood with resin and fibre, it becomes part of a system capable of opening flesh at a distance. This is one of the unsettling truths of deep prehistory. The oldest instruments of war were probably not designed as war instruments at all. They were hunting tools, survival tools, pieces of everyday engineering made by people who needed to bring down animals, cut hides, shape wood, scrape bone, and process food. The difference between a hunting arrow and a weapon used against a human being is not always in the object, it is in the target. Archaeology can recover the stone, but it cannot always recover the intention that guided the arm. Microlithic technology requires skill that is easy to underestimate. To make these pieces, a napper selects stone that fractures predictably, strikes it with controlled force, and produces narrow blades or flakes that can be retouched into specific shapes. Some are backed along one edge so they can be safely set into a shaft while the opposite edge remains sharp. Others may form tips or barbs. Several small pieces can be mounted together along a single projectile, creating a serrated cutting edge. If one breaks, it can be replaced without discarding the whole weapon. This is not crude improvisation, it is efficient design. The materials that held such weapons together rarely survive. Wooden shafts decay, plant fibres vanish, adhesives made from resin, gum, or bitumen-like substances disappear or survive only in exceptional conditions. Feathers, sinew, leather bindings, and carved handles are almost always gone. What archaeologists find is therefore the most durable part of a much more complex object. A stone point found near a skeleton may once have belonged to an arrow whose shaft was carefully balanced, whose binding had been tightened by practiced hands, whose maker understood both flight and penetration. The evidence remains incomplete, but the surviving fragments point toward a vanished world of craftsmanship. At Jebel Sahaba, stone pieces associated with the burial suggest that projectiles played a major role in the violence. Some fragments were found embedded in bone or closely associated with skeletal trauma. This matters because projectile weapons change the emotional and tactical structure of conflict. They allow distance, they allow ambush, they allow a person to injure another without entering the reach of a handheld weapon. In open fighting, distance can protect the attacker. In raids, it can create terror before the victim sees who is striking. A small stone point can carry social hostility across space. Yet close violence likely existed as well. Some injuries at prehistoric conflict sites suggest blows, fractures, and face-to-face struggle. Once a projectile wounds someone, attackers may close in, or defenders may fight back with clubs, spears, stones, or whatever is at hand. The clean categories of later military history do not fit easily here. There is no infantry, no archery corps, no command hierarchy that can be reconstructed. There are bodies, wounds, and tools. What survives in the record suggests a mix of distance and proximity, fear and force. Hunting itself prepares people for certain forms of organised violence. It teaches cooperation, silence, timing, tracking, and knowledge of terrain. A group of hunters understands how to approach without being noticed, how to wait near water, how to drive prey toward danger, how to read panic, how to finish a wounded animal. These skills do not automatically lead to warfare, but they can be redirected. A camp can be stalked, a path can be watched, a river crossing can become a trap. The same patience used to hunt antelope can be used against people. This does not mean prehistoric hunters were naturally warlike. That would flatten a complex human world into a simple moral lesson. Hunting also requires restraint, sharing, planning, and respect for group survival. Weapons spend most of their lives serving food, protection from animals, and practical labour. But in a landscape under pressure, where neighbouring groups may compete for the same riverbank or remember earlier injuries, the boundary between tool and weapon can become dangerously thin. A lesser-known detail is that some microlithic weapons may have been designed to break inside the wound. This is difficult to prove in every case, and scholars still debate the exact mechanics, but small stone inserts can detach or splinter on impact. For a hunted animal, this increases damage and blood loss. In a human body, the effect is equally grim. A tiny fragment lodged deep in tissue can cause infection, pain, reduced mobility, or death long after the strike. The archaeological trace may be only a small piece of stone near a rib or pelvis, but behind it lies a chain of suffering that bone alone can barely express. The use of projectiles also complicates the idea of courage and combat. Later societies often wrap war in stories of heroic confrontation, but the earliest evidence may point toward a colder reality, people killing from concealment, striking vulnerable targets, avoiding risk when possible. This is not primitive savagery, it is strategy. In small communities, losing even one capable adult can be disastrous, so minimizing danger to one's own group makes sense. Ambush is not cowardice in such a world, it is survival logic turned against human beings. Weapon wounds also carry messages. A body struck by multiple projectiles may reflect an effort to ensure death, but it may also show panic, group attack, or ritualized overkill. A survivor with a healed wound becomes living evidence of hostile contact. Others see the scar. They remember the story. Children learn from it. The weapon therefore continues working socially long after impact. It shapes movement, caution, resentment, and perhaps revenge. At Jebel Sahaba, the dead cannot tell us whether the attackers used bows, spear throwers, hand-thrown spears, or several weapon types. The precise reconstruction remains uncertain. But the broader point is clear enough: these people possessed technologies capable of lethal organized violence, and they used them against other humans. The weapons were not grand, they were not ceremonial, they were practical, portable, and effective. That practicality may be what makes them so disturbing. There is something almost invisible about such warfare. Metal weapons can be displayed, fortresses leave walls, mass graves announce catastrophe, but microlithic conflict can vanish into the earth with very little trace unless it intersects with bone in the right conditions. Many attacks in prehistory must have left no archaeological signature at all. Bodies exposed to scavengers disappear. Wounded survivors heal without leaving clear marks. Wooden weapons decay. Camps move. Sand covers the rest. Jebel Sahaba may seem exceptional not because violence was rare, but because preservation allowed us to see it. No single explanation fully accounts for why these tools became instruments of repeated human killing beside the Nile. But once the possibility exists, the river landscape appears differently. Reeds become cover, high ground becomes lookout, narrow paths become risk, a fishing place becomes something to defend. A stranger carrying the same kind of weapon used for hunting may also be carrying the means of attack. The technology of survival becomes, under pressure, the technology of fear. Before armies, there are weapons. Before weapons are symbols. They are tools. Before war has names, ranks, banners, and songs. It may begin with a sharpened stone set into a shaft, a group moving quietly near water, and a decision that another human body is now the target. The river gives life, but the river is not in control of the sky. Beyond the green edges of the Nile, climates shift across North Africa with a force that no community can bargain with. Rainfall moves, dry belts expand and contract, grasslands that once supported animals begin to thin, lakes retreat from old shorelines, winds lift dust from exposed ground and carry it across distances that would take a person many days to walk. The people beside the Nile do not know the language of paleoclimate, but they know the signs: fewer plants in familiar places, animals arriving later than expected, mud cracking too soon after floodwater falls, and camps that once felt safe becoming harder to sustain. The Late Ice Age is not one smooth thaw. It is a period of instability, with abrupt swings that can alter the conditions of life faster than oral memory can comfortably absorb. Around the time connected with Jebel Sahaba, northeastern Africa experiences significant environmental stress. The exact local sequence is debated, and scholars still refine the timing of wet and dry phases through sediment cores, pollen, lake deposits, and river history. Still, the wider pattern is clear enough. Human groups living in this region are not moving through a stable paradise. They are adapting to a landscape in motion. Climate does not kill in a single simple way. It squeezes, it narrows options. It turns a bad season into a dangerous one and a dangerous one into a social crisis. A drought does not command one group to attack another, but it can make a fishing ground more valuable. A shrinking wetland does not create hatred, but it can force groups into closer contact. A failed plant season does not produce war by itself, but it can weaken bodies, raise fear, and make risks seem necessary. No single explanation fully accounts for the violence at Jebel Sahaba, yet environmental stress offers one of the strongest backgrounds against which that violence makes sense. The Nile corridor is both refuge and trap. When surrounding lands are productive, people can spread out, they can avoid rivals, follow animals elsewhere, gather plants in wider territories, and reduce dangerous encounters simply by not being in the same place too often. But when dry conditions intensify, the dependable zones become magnets. The riverbanks, marshes, islands, floodplains, and backwaters attract everyone who needs water and food. A refuge becomes crowded. The very thing that saves life also concentrates competition. This may be one of the central pressures behind early organised violence. In a broad and generous landscape, moving away from conflict is often possible. In a narrow corridor, retreat may mean starvation. If one stretch of a river supports fish runs, nesting birds, edible reeds, and access to herds, then losing that stretch matters. A group pushed from it may not simply relocate with ease. They may enter someone else's range. They may return at night. They may fight. It is important not to imagine climate as a puppet master. People are not passive leaves blown by weather. They make decisions, form alliances, remember insults, show restraint, take revenge, share resources, refuse outsiders, and sometimes absorb newcomers. The evidence remains incomplete, but human communities under pressure often respond in many ways at once. They cooperate with some groups and distrust others. They exchange information while guarding access. They marry across boundaries, yet avenge killings across the same boundaries. Climate sets the stage, people write the violence onto it. The Nile's flood rhythm adds another layer. Floods can create abundance by spreading nutrient-rich silt and renewing wetlands. But flood behaviour is not always predictable. Too little water leaves channels poor and banks exposed. Too much can destroy camps, scatter food stores, drown low ground, or alter access to familiar places. A rich floodplain one year may become dangerous or inaccessible the next. Communities, depending on seasonal timing, must constantly adjust. When the rhythm falters, tension rises. A surprising detail from ancient river landscapes is how much human life depends on edges rather than centres. The edge between water and land, marsh and dry ground, grass and sand, shade and exposure, safety and danger. These edges are productive because different forms of life meet there. They are also unstable. A small environmental shift can move the edge and change who benefits. A backwater rich in fish can silt up. A channel can cut elsewhere. A campsite can become too exposed. A crossing can become easier for strangers to use. In such places, geography is never fixed for long. The bodies at Jebel Sahaba do not preserve drought, but they preserve what drought may have helped make possible. Wounds record the human outcome of pressures that also appear in climate archives. When researchers examine ancient sediments, they find broad evidence for environmental change. When they examine skeletons, they find trauma. Connecting the two requires caution. A dry phase does not automatically equal warfare. Many societies endure hardship without killing neighbours. But when violent trauma appears in a region where resources may have become concentrated and unpredictable, the connection becomes difficult to ignore. Hunger has social consequences long before starvation arrives. It changes how people interpret strangers. A group arriving at a fishing place might once have been tolerated during abundance. In scarcity, the same group becomes a threat. A request for access may sound like theft. A movement through territory may look like invasion. An old grievance may become newly intolerable because there is no surplus cushion left to absorb it. Fear sharpens moral boundaries. People who are hungry, or afraid of becoming hungry, may decide that generosity is too dangerous. Still, the Nile Valley was not simply a place of desperation. It could be rich, even spectacularly so. The contrast between abundance and vulnerability is what gives the setting its power. Fish, birds, mammals, plants, and water draw people in. Environmental uncertainty keeps them from fully relaxing. Life is possible here, perhaps better than in surrounding dry zones, but because it is possible, it is contested. The First War may not have emerged from absolute scarcity, but from the unequal distribution of reliable abundance. This distinction matters. People rarely fight over nothing. They fight over places that matter, routes that matter, people who matter, and memories that matter. Along the Nile, the valuable thing is not only food, but predictability. A dependable camp, a known fishing bend, a safe burial ground, a seasonal crossing, a stretch of reeds where birds gather year after year. To lose such places is to lose knowledge made practical. It is to lose the future that elders can confidently describe to children. As climates turn unstable, old knowledge becomes contested. If a group's familiar range dries, they must decide where to go. If they enter another group's area, they may bring not malice, but need. But need does not guarantee welcome. The newcomers may be seen as intruders, the residents may be seen as hoarders of life. Exchange may happen, marriage may happen, so may arrows in the reeds. At Jebel Sahaba, the dead lie at the intersection of these forces. They are not fossils of climate change, they are people, yet their injuries belong to a world where environmental stress likely made conflict more likely, more frequent, or harder to escape. The river that sustained them may also have confined them. The water that drew communities together may have made distance impossible. The green ribbon through the desert may have become a line of life sharp enough to cut. And beneath the grand movements of climate, the human scale remains painfully small. A child is carried to burial, an adult with an old wound dies from a newer one, a stone point enters bone. Survivors return to the same ground because the river is still there, because the dead are there, because leaving may be even more dangerous than staying. Climate turns against them not as a single disaster, but as pressure repeated through seasons, until the landscape itself seems to ask too much of those trying to live within it. At the edge of the Nile, the most dangerous person may not be a stranger in the absolute sense. He may be someone seen before at a distance, someone whose group camps beyond a certain bend, someone whose tools look slightly different, whose ornaments mark another set of kin, whose movements are recognised but not welcomed. Human conflict often grows not from total unfamiliarity, but from uneasy familiarity. The people who frighten a community are sometimes those close enough to compete, close enough to remember, and close enough to return. The world of Jebel Sahaba is not empty space divided only by nature. It is a social landscape. Every stretch of a river may carry stories. A place where fish are trapped during a falling flood is not just useful. It may be known, named, revisited, and defended. A gravel ridge rich in stone is not just geology. It is a workshop remembered by generations. A burial ground is not just soil. It is ancestry pressed into the earth. The evidence remains incomplete. But human groups, this skilled and socially complex, almost certainly carried mental maps filled with meanings that archaeology can only dimly sense. Identity in such a world can be marked in many ways. Clothing, body paint, scars, hair, beads, shell ornaments, toolmaking styles, language, gesture, and ritual practice may all signal belonging. Most of these signs disappear. A shell bead may survive, a stone tool style may survive, a burial position may survive, but the living texture of difference is mostly gone. Archaeologists see the bones and artifacts. They do not hear the accents, songs, warnings, insults, or kinship terms that once told people who was safe and who was not. Still, even without those vanished details, the cemetery suggests violence between groups rather than only private disputes within one camp. The number of affected individuals, the range of ages, and the patterns of injury point toward collective danger. A murder within a group can leave a body. Repeated attacks affecting men, women, and children across a cemetery imply something larger. Scholars still debate the exact scale and organisation. But what survives in the record suggests that the victims belong to a community repeatedly exposed to external violence or severe internal conflict. External conflict is often considered more likely, though certainty remains out of reach. If the violence came from neighbouring groups, the attackers may not have been culturally alien. They may have shared similar technologies, diets, landscapes, and even ancestry. This is important because later imagination often paints enemies as radically different peoples. In deep prehistory, difference may have been subtler and still deadly. Two groups can look similar to an archaeologist and remain sharply divided to themselves. A few river bends, a marriage rule, a remembered killing, or control over a seasonal resource can be enough to create an us and a them. Kinship would have shaped these boundaries powerfully. In small-scale societies, survival depends on networks of obligation. Who shares food when hunting fails? Who helps carry an injured person? Who marries whom? Who has the right to camp near a certain water source? Who must be avenged if killed? These are not abstract questions. They determine life chances. If one member of a group is attacked, the injury may demand a response not because people are irrationally violent, but because failing to respond could signal weakness and invite further danger. Revenge can be terrible, but within such systems it may also be understood as deterrence. This is where feud and war begin to overlap. A feud can start with a single death and become a chain of reciprocal violence between kin groups. War, in the later sense, often implies organised conflict between larger political communities. Jebel Sahaba sits in the uncomfortable space between these categories. There may be no chiefs commanding campaigns, yet there may be coordinated attacks. There may be no declared war, yet there may be recognised enemies. There may be no battlefield. Yet the landscape may be full of danger. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, because the categories themselves are modern tools being applied to a world that did not divide violence the same way. Migration may have added another pressure. As environments changed, groups may have moved along the Nile corridor, entering regions already used by others. New arrivals can bring useful knowledge, marriage possibilities, and exchange. They can also bring competition. The line between guest and intruder can be fragile, especially when food is uncertain. A group passing through during abundance may be tolerated. The same group returning during scarcity may be resisted. A conflict that begins as access negotiation can harden into lasting hostility if someone dies. Territory among mobile foragers is often misunderstood. It does not always mean fixed borders like later states, marked by walls or lines on maps. It can mean priority of access, remembered rights, seasonal expectations, and social permission. A group may not own a river bend in the legal sense, but they may expect others to ask, avoid, exchange, or marry into access. Violating those expectations can be dangerous. The absence of fences does not mean the absence of boundaries. At Jebel Sahaba, burial itself may reveal territorial attachment. Returning bodies to a particular cemetery suggests that this place mattered. If survivors continued to bury their dead there despite recurring violence, the ground may have been bound to identity. It may have served as a claim as much as a resting place. The dead make landscapes harder to abandon. A community can move camp, but leaving ancestors behind may carry emotional and ritual weight in times of conflict. Burial grounds can become silent declarations: these are our people, this is our place, we remain. A lesser-known detail in debates about early warfare is how often conflict and exchange coexist. Archaeologists sometimes find evidence that prehistoric groups shared materials across distance, even during periods when violence also occurred. This should not surprise us. Human relationships are rarely all peace or all war. A neighbouring group may be a source of spouses one generation and enemies the next. A trade partner may become a raider after drought. A rival may be invited to ceremony under certain conditions and attacked under others. The social world is not a simple map of friendly and hostile zones. It is a shifting field of trust. That complexity may lie behind the wounds at Jebel Sahaba. The people buried there may have known their attackers by reputation or by face. They may have shared river knowledge with them. They may have exchanged goods in better times. They may even have been distant kin, and then, under pressure, those connections failed. A contested place, an old killing, a migration, a resource shortage, or a perceived insult may have turned neighbours into enemies. The first war, if that is what we call it, may have been born not from absolute otherness, but from broken proximity. This makes the cemetery more haunting. It is easy to imagine violence against strangers as something happening at the edge of the known world. It is harder to imagine violence woven through a familiar landscape, among people who understand the same flood rhythms and fear the same dry seasons. Yet much of human conflict works exactly that way. The enemy is close enough to matter. Beside the Nile, identity, territory, kinship, and survival may have converged until the river became divided not by visible walls, but by memory. One group's safe bank became another group's danger. One fishing place became a point of confrontation. One burial ground became evidence of belonging. And somewhere in that dense human geography, stone points began to fly. The phrase "the First War" has a dangerous simplicity. It sounds like a thing one should be able to find, date, label, and place neatly at the beginning of a timeline. First fire, first tools, first art, first city, first war. But war is not an object. It does not fossilize cleanly. It is a pattern of behaviour, a social condition, a chain of intention and violence that may leave only scattered marks on bone, or may leave nothing at all. To call Jebel Sahaba the first war ever fought by humans is tempting because the cemetery is so old and the injuries are so striking. Yet the moment the phrase is used, the problems begin. What counts as war, a single killing does not usually qualify. One person murdering another in anger leaves violence, but not necessarily war. A family ambush after a dispute may be feud. A raid for food may be organised violence. But is it war if there is no permanent leadership, no declared enemy, no territory seized afterward? A massacre of one camp by another feels closer, but if it happens only once, does that make it war or atrocity? Recurring attacks between groups seem stronger evidence. But archaeology may struggle to distinguish them from many deaths spread across generations. Scholars still debate these boundaries because the categories were created long after the events they are used to describe. Later civilizations make war easier to recognise. Armies march, fortifications rise, weapons are manufactured in quantity, rulers boast in inscriptions, mass graves cluster near destroyed towns, burn layers mark conquest. There are helmets, shields, chariot fittings, arrowheads in walls, siege ramps, trauma patterns, and written claims of victory. Even then, interpretation can be difficult because rulers lie and monuments exaggerate. In deep prehistory, the problem is far harder. There are no royal inscriptions, no maps, no names of peoples, no battlefield reports. There are only bodies, tools, settlement traces, and environmental context. Jebel Sahaba sits precisely at this difficult edge. It is not merely evidence of interpersonal violence. Too many individuals show trauma. The victims include different ages and sexes. Projectile injuries suggest attacks from outside intimate one-on-one struggle. Some wounds appear healed, implying earlier episodes. This points toward repeated collective violence, but it is still not war in the later state sense. There are no armies. There may be no professional fighters. There is no proof of command structure, ideology, conquest, or formal territorial campaign. The evidence remains incomplete, and so the phrase First War must be handled carefully. One way to approach the problem is to think in terms of scale, organisation, and repetition. Violence becomes more warlike when groups act together, when enemies are socially defined, when attacks are not isolated accidents, and when conflict persists over time. Jebel Sahaba may meet several of these conditions. The injuries suggest more than sudden private disputes. The recurrence implied by healed trauma suggests continuity. The community-wide distribution suggests that violence affected a social group as a group. What survives in the record suggests organised hostility, even if it was not war as later kings would recognise it. Another way is to examine intention. Were the attackers trying to kill individuals encountered by chance, or were they targeting members of a rival community? Archaeology cannot read intention directly. It infers it from patterns. If many members of one burial population show weapon injuries, and if those injuries occur across adults and children, then the possibility of group targeting becomes stronger. But the motive remains hidden. It could be revenge, competition, fear, resource defence. Or a combination of these. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. There is also the problem of preservation. The earliest war ever fought may not be the earliest war ever found. This distinction is crucial. Human beings have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, and anatomically modern humans far longer than the date of Jebel Sahaba. Most bodies from that vast span are gone. Most camps have vanished. Many landscapes used by Ice Age people now lie underwater, because sea levels rose after the glaciers melted. Tropical environments destroy bone quickly. River systems erode old surfaces. Later human activity disturbs ancient ground. A prehistoric conflict could kill many people, and leave no trace archaeologists can identify. The first known evidence is not necessarily the first occurrence. This is why certainty is dangerous. Jebel Sahaba may be among the earliest strong archaeological cases for organised intergroup violence, but it cannot prove that war began there. It proves that by around 13,000 years ago, some human communities were experiencing repeated lethal violence severe enough to mark many bodies. The true origin may be older. It may lie in a site not yet excavated, or in one destroyed without record, or in an episode that left no surviving bones. The beginning of war may not be a point at all, but a long threshold crossed in different places under different pressures. The distinction between feud and war is especially important. In many small-scale societies, feuding can involve planned attacks, ambushes, revenge killings, and cycles of retaliation lasting years. Such violence can be highly organised without resembling state warfare. People may know exactly who their enemies are, when to strike, whom to avoid, and what deaths demand response. If the conflict becomes embedded in group identity, it can function socially like war even without chiefs or armies. Jebel Sahaba may belong to this world, not war in the grand later sense, but not mere murder either. This middle ground is uncomfortable because it disrupts simple stories. One simple story says humans were peaceful until agriculture trapped them in property and hierarchy. Another says humans have always been naturally warlike, with civilization merely enlarging an ancient instinct. Jebel Sahaba supports neither extreme. It shows that organised violence existed before farming, but it does not show that all prehistoric life was dominated by warfare. It shows community under severe stress. Not a universal human condition, it reveals possibility, not destiny. A lesser-known complication is that skeletal trauma can undercount violence. Many lethal injuries affect soft tissue and leave no mark on bone. A person shot through the abdomen, throat, or thigh might die without skeletal evidence. Poison, drowning, strangulation, and blood loss may vanish archaeologically. Even projectile wounds can disappear if the stone misses bone and the body decays. This means that a cemetery where nearly half the individuals show trauma may represent an even more violent reality than the bones alone indicate. At the same time, some ambiguous marks may be overinterpreted if caution is not maintained. Archaeology must hold both truths. Evidence can be incomplete by absence and uncertain by presence. The word first also encourages a search for a dramatic beginning, but human behaviour rarely begins so neatly. Before organised war, there may have been isolated killings. Before repeated raids, there may have been threats, chases, thefts, and boundary disputes. Before massacres, there may have been avoidance and fear. War may have emerged gradually from smaller forms of violence as population density, environmental pressure, memory, and weapon technology interacted. By the time Jebel Sahaba appears in the record, the process may already have a long hidden history. Still, the site deserves its unsettling reputation. It stands near the earliest visible horizon where collective violence becomes difficult to deny. It forces scholars to ask not only when humans first fought, but how to recognise fighting when the evidence is almost gone. It asks whether war requires armies or only enemies. It asks whether a child killed by a projectile in a riverbank raid belongs to the history of war, even if no soldier ever stood beside her. It asks whether the first wars were not declared, not remembered in epics, not carved into stone, but buried quietly by survivors who had no word for archaeology and no reason to imagine that their grief would one day become evidence. So the problem remains open. Jebel Sahaba may not be the first war ever fought by humans. It may be the earliest warlike conflict we can currently see with unusual clarity. It may be a massacre, a feud, a series of raids, or all of these woven together across time. But whatever name is chosen, the cemetery shows that long before history began writing down battles, the human past had already learned how to turn group fear into organised killing. The First War problem is not only about finding the oldest battlefield, it is about recognising that war begins in the shadows before it ever steps into history's light. Jebel Sahaba is not alone in the darkness. It stands out because it is old, vivid, and deeply disturbing, but it is part of a wider pattern of clues scattered across the ancient world. Some are older hints of individual violence, some are later, clearer scenes of group killing, some are disputed, some are unmistakable. Together, they show that the question of the First War does not belong to one cemetery alone. It belongs to a long shadow moving through prehistory, visible only where preservation, discovery, and interpretation happen to meet. One of the most important comparisons comes from Naturuk, near Lake Turkana in Kenya. There, archaeologists found the remains of hunter-gatherers who died roughly 10,000 years ago, perhaps a little later than Jebel Sahaba, but still before the full spread of farming in many regions. The bodies include adults, and at least one pregnant woman, with injuries suggesting a violent attack. Some individuals appear to have been struck, bound, or left unburied near a former wetland. Like Jebel Sahaba, Naturuk unsettles the old assumption that organised group violence required agriculture, property, and permanent villages. It suggests that mobile or semi-mobile foragers could also become caught in a lethal conflict when circumstances aligned. Yet Naturuk is different in a crucial way. The dead there do not seem to have been carefully buried in a cemetery. They appear more like bodies left where they fell, later preserved by sediment. This gives the site a different emotional weight. Jebel Sahaba shows violence followed by burial care. Naturuk may show violence followed by abandonment, or at least the absence of recovery. Scholars still debate details of the site, including how to interpret body positions and injuries. But the broad impression is stark: a small group attacked in a landscape rich enough to attract competition. Again, water is nearby. Again, a productive edge becomes a dangerous place. Later, in Neolithic Europe, the evidence becomes harder to dismiss because the scale and clarity increase. Sites such as Talheim in Germany, Schletz in Austria, and other massacre graves reveal communities where many individuals were killed violently, often with blows to the head or other traumatic injuries, These people lived thousands of years after Jebel Sahaba, in farming societies with villages, fields, stored food, and more obvious territorial stakes. At some sites, entire settlement populations may have been attacked, bodies are thrown into pits, children die with adults. Some groups appear to have been targeted so completely that the archaeological record feels almost like a vanished village caught in its final hour. These later massacres are not the beginning of violence, but they reveal how violence changes when people settle. Farming anchors communities to land. Fields cannot be carried away, granaries can be stolen, livestock can be raided, houses can be burned, boundaries harden because moving on becomes costly. The dead of Neolithic massacre sites show that once humans begin investing labour into fixed places, conflict can become both more territorial and more devastating. But Jebel Sahaba warns that the roots are older. Agriculture may intensify war, but it does not invent the human capacity for it. There are also earlier isolated cases that complicate the story further. A skull with a healed injury, a skeleton with a spear wound, a body showing signs of deliberate killing. Such finds stretch deep into the Pleistocene and sometimes involve archaic humans as well as Homo sapiens. But individual violence is not the same as war. A single broken skull may reflect murder, accident, ritual, punishment, or conflict. The evidence remains incomplete, and context is everything. This is why Jebel Sahaba matters so strongly. It is not only one injured person, but a cemetery population marked by repeated trauma. Across the world, prehistoric violence leaves uneven traces. In some regions, rock art appears to show fighting, archers facing other archers, bodies pierced by lines, groups in confrontation. Such images are powerful, but they are difficult to date and interpret. A painted figure with arrows may represent myth, ritual, hunting symbolism, or real conflict. In other places, fortifications appear around settlements, suggesting fear of attack, ditches, palisades, walls. And elevated refuges become visible signs that people no longer trust the open landscape. But these belong mostly to later periods. By then, the long shadow has already grown into something more recognisable. One surprising detail is how often early violence seems connected to places of abundance, not barren emptiness. Wetlands, lake shores, river valleys, fertile edges, and productive corridors appear again and again. This seems counterintuitive only at first. People do not gather where there is nothing, they gather where life is possible, and when life is possible in limited places, those places become valuable. The same environment that supports dense human activity can also increase contact. Competition, jealousy, and fear, Jebel Sahaba by the Nile and Nataruk near a wetland both fit this pattern. Rich landscapes can be generous, but they can also become crowded. The comparison with later battlefields is tempting but misleading. A Bronze Age battlefield with organised armies, standardised weapons, and political objectives belongs to a different world. The famous later cases, where states mobilise fighters over territory, tribute, or royal ambition, show war after hierarchy has transformed it. Jebel Sahaba and Nataruk show something more embryonic and less formal. There may be no soldiers, yet there are victims. There may be no commanders, yet there is coordination. There may be no empire, yet there is enemyhood. This is why the word war must remain flexible but cautious. In later sites, war announces itself through infrastructure forts, mass graves, weapon deposits, destruction layers. In earlier sites, war hides inside injuries. It appears not as architecture, but as trauma. A pelvis pierced by a projectile, a skull fractured by a blow, a child buried among the violently dead. What survives in the record suggests that the earliest collective violence was not always monumental. It was bodily. Comparisons also reveal what is missing from Jebel Sahaba. There is no burned settlement attached to the cemetery, no clear attackers, no visible destroyed camp, no weapon cache that can be tied to one event, no written record naming enemies. This absence does not erase the violence, but it limits interpretation. Later massacre sites sometimes preserve settlement context more clearly, making it easier to infer attack and destruction. Jebel Sahaba preserves bodies with extraordinary force, but not the full scene around them. No single explanation fully accounts for everything, because too much of the living landscape has vanished. Still, placing Jebel Sahaba beside other ancient shadows makes its significance stronger, not weaker. It is not an isolated oddity that can be dismissed as a strange exception. It belongs to a broader human pattern in which group violence appears under certain conditions across different regions and lifeways. Foragers can fight, farmers can fight, villagers can massacre, states can industrialize killing, the forms change, but the roots reach into the deep past. And yet the comparisons also keep the story grounded. They prevent one site from carrying more certainty than it can bear. Jebel Sahaba may be the earliest strong evidence of warlike violence, but other sites remind us that the archaeological record is patchy. Nataruk shows a different form of hunter-gatherer violence. Neolithic graves show what happens when settled. Life intensifies conflict. Later fortifications show fear becoming architecture. Each site is a fragment. And together the fragments reveal not a single origin point, but a widening pattern. The first war, then, may not have one birthplace. It may have emerged many times wherever human groups became close enough, organised enough, fearful enough, and pressured enough to kill collectively. Jebel Sahaba remains near the beginning of what can be seen. It is one of the first places where the shadow has a shape, but beyond it lie other bodies, other wounds, other landscapes where water, food, memory, and fear converged. The cemetery by the Nile is not the whole story. It is the first clear doorway into a much older darkness. Behind every wound in the cemetery there is a day that began before the violence reached it. This is easy to forget because archaeology often introduces these people through their deaths. They become skeletons, trauma patterns, burial numbers, projectile fragments, age estimates, and debates in journals. But none of them experienced life as evidence. They woke into heat, wind, hunger, voices, insects, waterlight, and the ordinary obligations of belonging. They carried baskets, sharpened stone. Watched children, listened for animals in the reeds, and judged the river's mood by signs that no modern observer could fully recover. Their deaths are what preserved them for the question of the First War, but their lives are what make that question matter. A person living near the Nile at this time is surrounded by knowledge, not abstract knowledge written in symbols, but practical knowledge held in the body. How to move quietly through mud without leaving too much sound. How to cut reeds without slicing the hand. How to prepare fish before heat spoils it. How to tell a crocodile's slide from the drag of a branch. How to recognise whether strangers have passed recently by the freshness of footprints near a bank. Children learn these things gradually, through repetition and correction, by making mistakes under the eyes of older people who have survived long enough to become memory keepers. The community is likely small, but small does not mean simple. Relationships are dense. Everyone's action affects everyone else. A skilled hunter's injury matters to food. A grandmother's memory matters to seasonal movement. A child's survival matters to the future. A conflict with another group is therefore not only a political event in the later sense, it is domestic. It enters the sleeping place, the cooking place, the path to water, the way adults speak when children are nearby. The evidence remains incomplete, but the social impact of repeated violence in such a community would have been immense. Imagine, without inventing a specific scene too confidently, what a healed wound means in daily life. A man or woman struck by a projectile survives. The stone is removed, or perhaps a fragment remains deep inside. The wound closes badly, fever may come. Others bring water, food, plant medicines, shade, attention. Survival depends not only on the body but on care. When bone heals, it records biology. But behind biology there may be weeks of social effort. Someone unable to walk must be helped. Someone in pain cannot gather or fish normally. A scar becomes a visible reminder that the group absorbed the cost of violence together. That is one of the quiet truths hidden inside the cemetery. The wounded who survived earlier attacks were not left behind immediately. At least some lived long enough for healing to occur. This suggests support. It suggests that prehistoric violence existed alongside compassion, endurance, and obligation. A society capable of organised killing is also a society capable of nursing the injured. Human beings do not become simple because they are ancient. The same group may fear outsiders and protect its own with astonishing tenderness. For children, violence changes the boundaries of the known world. A child near the Nile may be taught not only where to find edible plants, but where not to go alone. Certain bends may carry warnings. Certain times of day may be avoided. Adults may become tense when distant figures appear. Play may stop when dogs, if present in the broader region, or human watchers sense movement, even without dogs. Human ears and eyes are trained to alertness. The archaeological record cannot preserve the tightening of a parent's hand around a child's wrist, but it can preserve the tragic fact that some children died violently. No single explanation fully accounts for their presence among the wounded dead, yet it tells us that conflict reached beyond those who could defend themselves. Burial brings the living back into view. The dead of Jebel Sahaba are not scattered randomly across open ground. They are placed into graves, and that placement requires choice. Someone must decide where the grave goes, how the body is arranged, whether objects accompany it, whether the grave is reopened or respected, whether the dead are grouped by kin or event or practical necessity. Even under threat, burial is labour. It takes time and exposes the living to heat, animals, perhaps enemies. To bury the violently dead is to insist that they remain persons, not refuse left by conflict. This care may also have helped survivors hold the community together. Grief can fracture a group, but shared mourning can also strengthen identity. A cemetery containing victims of repeated attacks may become a place where loss accumulates into memory. Each burial adds another story. The ground becomes emotionally heavier. It may mark not only where people are buried, but what the group has endured. What survives in the record suggests that the dead were important enough to be gathered and remembered, even when the world around them was unstable. The practical consequences of violence would have rippled through daily life. If adults are killed or injured, food production suffers. If travel becomes dangerous, access to stone sources, plant zones, or hunting grounds may shrink. If people avoid certain areas, they may overuse others. If fear forces camps closer together or farther from the best resources, hunger can worsen. Violence and scarcity can reinforce one another. A raid may begin over resource pressure, then create new pressure by making movement unsafe. The cycle does not need large numbers to be devastating. There is also the psychological burden, though archaeology can approach it only indirectly. People who experience repeated attacks may become vigilant, suspicious, quicker to interpret movement as threat. They may sleep differently, they may post watchers, they may choose camps for visibility rather than comfort. They may move at times when they are less likely to be seen. Such behaviours rarely leave clear traces. but they are reasonable inferences from the kind of recurring dangers suggested by the cemetery. Scholars still debate the exact nature of the violence, but if attacks happened more than once, the survivors could not have experienced the landscape innocently afterward. One lesser-known aspect of early conflict is that even non-combatants can become strategists of survival. Older people may remember safer routes. Women gathering plants may detect signs of outsiders. Children may be trained to stay silent at certain moments. Injured people may advise from experience. Defense is not only fighting, it is awareness, movement, concealment, warning, avoidance, and decision-making in a small community. Security is woven through ordinary life rather than separated into a military class. The people of Jebel's Harbour lived before professional warriors, yet they may have known who among them was brave, reckless, skilled with a bow, good at tracking, calm under fear, or dangerous in anger. Reputation matters in small societies. A person who survives an attack may gain status, pity, suspicion, or responsibility. A person who fails to avenge a relative may be judged. A person who argues for leaving a contested area may be heard or ignored. These human tensions leave few marks, but they form the living background behind the bones. The cemetery also reminds us that survival is not only biological, it is cultural. A group survives by passing on knowledge, maintaining bonds, and preserving a sense of itself through loss. Repeated violence threatens all of this. It kills knowledge holders, it disrupts marriage ties, it produces orphans, it pushes people to merge with allies or flee into unfamiliar zones. A small group can disappear not through total annihilation, but through absorption, dispersal, and the fading of its particular memories. The dead remain visible, the transformed survivors vanish into the broader human story. And yet they did survive long enough to bury. That fact deserves attention. The sight is grim, but it is not only a record of defeat. Each grave is also evidence of survivors who returned, who handled grief, who maintained ritual under pressure. Even if the community eventually moved, merged, or disappeared, they created a place where their dead endured for thousands of years. The first war, or the first warlike conflict we can see, is therefore not only a story of killing, it is also a story of people trying to remain human after killing had entered their world. The bones show wounds, the graves show care. Between those two facts lies the vanished life of a community at the water's edge, carrying fear, memory, skill, and tenderness through a landscape that gave them no easy refuge. For a long time, one of the most comfortable explanations for war was that it began with farming. The argument has an appealing order to it. First, humans settle down, then they plant fields, store grain, build houses, raise animals, mark territory, accumulate wealth, defend property, and eventually fight over all of it. War, in this view, is a child of agriculture. Before fields and granaries, there may have been quarrels and killings, but not true organised conflict. The hunter-gatherer world becomes, if not peaceful, then at least less burdened by the heavy machinery of war. Jebel's Harbour makes that story harder to tell. The people buried there are not farmers. They do not live in cities. They do not leave behind palaces, temples, walls, or administrative seals. They belong to a world of fishing, hunting, gathering, movement, seasonal knowledge, and riverine survival. And yet many of them carry injuries made by weapons. Some appear to have survived earlier violence before dying later. The cemetery does not fit neatly into the idea that war must wait for agriculture to invent it. What survives in the record suggests that organised violence can arise wherever human groups have enough reason, memory, and pressure to treat other groups as enemies. This does not mean agriculture is irrelevant. Farming changes conflict profoundly. Once people invest labour in fields, irrigation, houses, storage pits, and herds, they become more tied to place. A farming village cannot simply follow the seasons away from danger without losing its crops. Stored food can be stolen. Land cleared by one generation becomes inheritance for the next. Population density rises. Leadership structures can become more formal. Inequality may deepen. All of this can intensify warfare and make it more visible archaeologically. But intensification is not origin. A fire can grow larger when fed with dry wood, but that does not mean the spark began there. The world before agriculture already contains things worth defending. It contains water, stone sources, fishing places, seasonal camps, burial grounds, marriage networks, hunting territories, and routes through difficult land. These are not property in the later legal sense, but they are valuable. They carry memory and expectation. If another group blocks access to a dependable riverbed during a hungry season, the loss can be severe. If people are attacked while gathering food, the injury is not abstract. It reaches directly into survival. No single explanation fully accounts for the violence at Jebel Sahaba, but the site shows that the ingredients of conflict existed before crops. One surprising truth is that mobile people may sometimes be intensely territorial, especially around key resources. Mobility does not mean indifference to place. A group that moves seasonally may rely on a chain of known locations, each one important at a particular time of year. Losing one link in that chain can disrupt the whole pattern. A wet season plant zone, a dry season water source, a gravel ridge for toolstone, a burial ground. And a fish-rich channel may together form a lived territory without fences. To outsiders, it may look open. To those who depend on it, it may be full of rites, obligations, and dangers. Agriculture also did not create human memory. Before farming, people already remembered injuries, deaths, alliances, and insults. They already had kinship, they already had social identities, they already had weapons and the ability to plan. They could coordinate hunts, share labour, travel in groups, and teach children whom to trust. These capacities are enough to support organised violence under certain conditions. Farming later gives war new fuel, but the social mind capable of war is older. This point matters because it changes how the deep human past is understood. If war began only with agriculture, then violence could be seen mainly as a corruption of settled life, a tragic side effect of civilization's inventions. If organised violence is older, then the story becomes more complicated. Human beings are capable of cooperation on extraordinary scales, but also of forming hostile boundaries long before states teach them how. The roots of war are not simply in kings or grain stores. They lie also in fear, belonging, scarcity, revenge, and the ability to imagine another group as a threat. Still, the opposite mistake must also be avoided. Jebel Sahaba does not prove that prehistoric foragers lived in constant war. It does not prove that violence is inevitable in every human society. Many hunter-gatherer groups across time and place have relied heavily on cooperation, exchange, avoidance, and social mechanisms that reduce conflict. Some conflicts end through marriage, compensation, ritual settlement, or simple distance. The evidence remains incomplete. And one cemetery cannot stand for the entire human species. It shows possibility, not universality. The site is most powerful when it is allowed to remain specific, a particular landscape, a particular period of environmental pressure, a particular community along the Nile, a particular pattern of wounds. From that specificity comes a broader insight. Warlike violence does not require all the machinery of a later civilization. It can grow from smaller roots. It can emerge among people whose material lives are simple by later standards, but whose social worlds are rich, tense, and deeply meaningful. Later farming societies will take these older tendencies and change them. They will build ditches and palisades. They will cluster houses behind defences. They will store food in ways that attract raiders. They will create leaders who can mobilise groups beyond immediate kin. They will develop symbols of warrior identity. They will produce weapons in greater numbers. Eventually, states will turn violence into policy, taxation into armies, and memory into propaganda. But the emotional grammar of conflict is already older us and them. Loss and revenge, fear and protection, place and survival. At Jebel Sahaba, the absence of agriculture does not make the violence less organised. In some ways, it makes it more revealing. Stripped of kings, wealth, and written ideology, the conflict points toward basic human pressures. People need water. People protect kin. People remember harm. People compete when safe alternatives shrink. People can cooperate beautifully within a group and act brutally toward another. Scholars still debate how much of this cemetery reflects massacre, feud, or repeated raiding, but the fact that such debate is necessary before farming fully enters the picture is itself significant. The First War may therefore not be a product of civilization collapsing into violence. It may be one of the darker capacities that civilization inherits, enlarges, organises, and records. Agriculture does not create the human ability to kill in groups. It gives that ability new places to root, new resources to defend, and eventually new institutions to command it. The older roots remain by the river, in a cemetery where the dead were not farmers, not soldiers, not subjects of kings. And yet we're caught in something that looks disturbingly like war before history had a name for it. The closer one looks at Jebel Sahaba, the more powerful the evidence becomes, but also the more fragile. This is the paradox of deep prehistory. A cemetery can transform the story of human violence, yet every claim rests on remains damaged by time, excavation, environment, and interpretation. The dead speak only through what survived, and what survived is partial. Bone is not a witness in the way a written account is a witness. It does not explain itself, it must be read. And every reading carries uncertainty. The first limit is preservation. A human body is a temporary thing unless conditions intervene. Heat, water, soil chemistry, scavengers, insects, roots, erosion, and later disturbance all work against survival. At Jebel Sahaba, enough bone endured to reveal trauma, but not enough to reconstruct every injury or death with certainty. Soft tissue is gone, blood loss is gone, infection is gone, facial expressions, fear, sound, movement, and sequence are gone. A stone fragment near bone may be eloquent, but it is still only a fragment. The violence that left no mark on skeletons has disappeared almost completely. This means the cemetery may understate what happened. If a projectile entered the abdomen and missed bone, the person could die without leaving skeletal evidence. If someone was struck in the throat, poisoned, drowned, strangled, or killed by wounds to soft tissue, archaeology might see nothing. Some victims may never have been buried. Some bodies may have been taken by animals, lost in the river, or placed in graves that did not survive. What survives in the record suggests substantial violence, but it may be the visible edge of something larger. At the same time, the cemetery may also tempt overinterpretation. Not every break in ancient bone is a wound from life. Some fractures happen after death as sediment presses downward, as roots pry through graves, as water shifts deposits, or as bones are exposed and handled. Excavation in earlier decades did not always use the techniques available today. Finds from rescue campaigns were often made under intense pressure. with limited time and imperfect documentation by modern standards. This does not invalidate the site, but it requires caution. The evidence remains incomplete, and sometimes the difference between a lethal wound and later damage depends on careful microscopic analysis. There is also the problem of context lost beneath water. The construction of the Aswan High Dam changed the archaeology of Nubia forever. Many sites were rescued, but many more were submerged. Landscapes that might have clarified Jebel Sahaba's world now lie beneath Lake Nasser: camps, tool-making areas, additional cemeteries, animal remains, and environmental clues may have vanished before they were fully recorded. The cemetery survived as a data point, but the broader landscape around it is partly gone. No single explanation fully accounts for the violence, because some of the evidence that might have tested explanations is no longer reachable. Dating brings another challenge. Archaeological dates are not always sharp points on a calendar. They are ranges, estimates, samples, and probabilities. Organic material can be contaminated. Associated material may not perfectly date a burial. Reanalysis can refine or complicate earlier chronologies. Jebel Sahaba is broadly placed around the end of the Pleistocene, roughly 13,000 years ago, but the exact span of cemetery use matters greatly. If the burials accumulated quickly, the massacre interpretation gains strength. If they accumulated over decades or generations, recurring conflict becomes more likely. Scholars still debate aspects of this timing, and the difference changes the story. Even trauma analysis has limits. A projectile injury may indicate attack, but from whom a skull fracture may indicate interpersonal violence. But in what setting? A healed wound may reflect earlier conflict, hunting accident, animal encounter, or domestic dispute, though the overall pattern makes human violence strongly plausible. An embedded stone point may reveal weapon use, but not whether the attacker was a stranger, neighbour, kin, or member of the same group. Archaeology can show that a body was struck. It cannot always tell why. The danger lies in turning fragments into certainty too quickly. A cemetery of wounded people invites narrative. The mind wants scenes attackers appearing from reeds, a camp at dawn, arrows crossing the riverbank, survivors digging graves. Such scenes may be plausible, but plausibility is not proof. Documentary storytelling must move carefully here. It can evoke the world, but it must not pretend to know what the evidence cannot say. The dead deserve imagination, but also restraint. A lesser-known difficulty is that modern categories can distort ancient realities. Words like war, massacre, feud, tribe, territory, and enemy carry meanings shaped by later societies. The people of Jebel Sahaba may have understood conflict through kinship obligations, spiritual fears, seasonal rites, personal vengeance, or identities that do not map neatly onto modern terms. Calling the site a war may help communicate its severity, but it may also impose too formal a structure. Calling it a feud may capture repetition, but perhaps understate organised group hostility. Calling it a massacre may capture horror, but perhaps erase the longer history of wounds. Each term illuminates and hides. There is also the temptation to use Jebel Sahaba as evidence in arguments about human nature. Some want it to prove that violence is ancient and therefore inevitable. Others want to minimize it to protect a vision of prehistoric peace. Both uses are too blunt. The cemetery does not settle human nature. It reveals what one community, in one changing landscape, experienced. It shows that humans are capable of organized killing before agriculture, but it also shows burial care, survival, and social obligation. The same evidence contains brutality and tenderness. To force it into a simple philosophical answer is to flatten the people buried there. Archaeology works best when it holds contradiction. The cemetery is strong evidence for severe violence. It is not a complete account of the conflict. The victims were likely part of a community under pressure. The exact attackers remain unknown. Climate may have contributed. It cannot be blamed alone. Repeated raids may explain the healed wounds. A catastrophic event may still have occurred. The site may be one of the earliest windows onto warlike conflict. It is not necessarily the absolute beginning of war. This uncertainty does not make the story weaker. It makes it more honest. Mystery in history is not merely what has not yet been solved. It is also what may never be fully recoverable, because the conditions for knowing have disappeared. The people who could explain Jebel Sahaba didn't write. Their languages are gone. Their names are gone. Their relationships are gone. Their enemies, if enemies they were, are gone. What remains is a pattern of injuries strong enough to disturb and incomplete enough to resist final judgment. So the cemetery stands as both evidence and warning. It warns against imagining the ancient past as peaceful simply because its violence often vanished. It warns against imagining every wound as proof of war simply because war is familiar to later history. It warns that human stories can survive as bone and stone while losing almost everything that made them intelligible to those who lived them. The first war, in the end, may be partly unknowable, not because nothing happened, but because too much happened outside the reach of preservation. Jebel Sahaba gives us a glimpse, bodies carefully buried, weapons lodged in bone, injuries healed and unhealed, children and adults caught in the same pattern of danger. It does not give us the final sentence. The silence around the evidence remains, and in that silence the mystery deepens rather than disappears. Over thousands of years, the violence glimpsed at Jebel Sahaba begins to change shape. The essential human elements remain recognizable: fear, belonging, revenge, competition, protection. But the scale grows larger, the structures more rigid, and the consequences more permanent. Small groups guarding riverbanks gradually give way to villages guarding fields. Villages give way to chiefdoms, kingdoms, and states. The scattered wounds of prehistoric conflict slowly evolve into organized systems of warfare, until armies become institutions and violence becomes one of civilization's defining tools. The transition is uneven and slow. There is no single moment when raids become wars in the later sense. Instead, many small developments accumulate. Agriculture spreads through different regions at different times. Populations increase. Settlements become more permanent. People invest labour into houses, irrigation channels, storage pits, livestock pens, and cleared land. A camp abandoned after danger becomes a village that cannot move easily. The cost of losing territory rises. Defending place becomes more urgent. Archaeology begins to reveal this transformation physically. Defensive structures appear. Ditches surround settlements. Wooden palisades are raised. Villages are placed on hills or protected ridges. Entrances narrow into choke points. In some places, houses cluster tightly together as though safety itself has become architecture. These are not monuments to glory, they are monuments to fear. What survives in the record suggests that by the Neolithic period, many communities expected violence often enough to build against it. Weapons evolve as well. Stone remains important for long periods, but specialised forms appear. Axes become polished and durable. Projectile technology improves. Later, metallurgy changes everything. Copper, bronze, and eventually iron allow stronger blades, spearheads, armours, and tools. Yet the deeper transformation is social rather than technological. Violence becomes organised beyond immediate kinship. Leaders emerge who can mobilise groups larger than extended families. Ritual, status, and identity begin attaching themselves to fighting. One of the most important changes is the rise of the warrior as a social role. At Jebel Sahaba, there are victims and probably attackers, but there is no clear evidence of a separate warrior class. People who fought likely also hunted, gathered, fished, and performed ordinary labour. Later societies begin distinguishing fighters from non-fighters more sharply. Certain individuals gain prestige through combat ability. Weapons become symbols of rank as well as survival. Graves include martial objects not merely because they are useful, but because they represent identity. This shift can already be sensed in some late prehistoric societies. Burials begin showing status differences. Young men may be interred with weapons, ornaments, or signs of elite position. Rock art in some regions depicts organised groups of archers or fighters. Rituals surrounding combat grow more elaborate. Violence becomes tied not only to survival, but to honour, authority, and political ambition. The first warlike conflicts of prehistory slowly harden into traditions of warfare. Still, the old patterns never disappear completely. Environmental pressure continues driving conflict even in more complex societies. Droughts destroy crops, rivers change course, pastures fail, migrations disrupt borders. The same pressures that may have contributed to violence along the ancient Nile remain visible across later history. Climate alone never explains war, but unstable environments repeatedly intensify competition between human groups. The Nile itself eventually becomes home to one of the world's earliest great states. Kingdoms rise along the river thousands of years after Jebel Sahaba. Pharaohs command labour, armies, monuments, and trade networks. Written records begin preserving campaigns, victories, prisoners, tribute, and territorial ambition. War enters history fully visible. Kings boast of crushing enemies beneath chariot wheels. Fortresses guard frontiers. Soldiers march under authority larger than kinship. Yet beneath the grandeur lies something familiar: control of fertile land, protection of river access, fear of outsiders. The same ancient human concerns remain, only magnified. A lesser-known detail is how often early states relied on older traditions of local violence rather than replacing them entirely. Central authority could organise armies, but feud, raiding, revenge, and small-scale conflict persisted beneath official power. Human societies rarely move cleanly from chaos to order. Instead, older forms of conflict survive inside newer systems. The local raid and the imperial campaign can exist simultaneously. The emotional structure of violence remains surprisingly durable even when political systems transform. As warfare expands, so does its psychological distance. At Jebel Sahaba, violence is intimate. Victims and attackers likely know the same landscape closely. Later warfare increasingly allows killing at larger scales and greater distances. Armies can destroy people who have never met one another personally. States can command violence through hierarchy. Writing can justify war ideologically. Religion, kingship, and nationalism can frame enemies as existential threats. The human mind that once guarded a fishing place now governs empires. And yet there is continuity in the archaeological traces. A skeleton pierced by a stone point beside the Nile, and a skeleton pierced by an iron spear in a later battlefield, both preserve the same basic fact: another human being chose to harm this person. Technology changes the method. Organisation changes the scale. The core action remains hauntingly stable. The growth of warfare also reshapes landscapes. Forests are cut for fortifications and ships. Agricultural land expands to support armies. Roads appear for movement and supply. Frontier zones become militarised. Entire settlements vanish after conquest. In later centuries, walls rise around cities as though civilization itself understands how vulnerable it is. The world becomes increasingly marked by preparation for conflict. But the farther history moves into organised warfare, the easier it becomes to overlook the small beginnings. Massive armies and famous battles dominate memory because they leave monuments and texts. Prehistoric violence leaves only injuries and silence, yet the silence matters precisely because it comes first. Before generals and empires, human groups already knew how to divide the world into allies and enemies. They already understood retaliation. They already carried weapons through landscapes shaped by fear. Jebel Sahaba therefore stands not only at the edge of violence, but at the beginning of a long transformation. The cemetery belongs to a world before states, yet it foreshadows much later patterns: repeated attacks, resource competition, group identity, civilian vulnerability, burial after violence. None of these disappear from history. They simply grow larger and more organised. Scholars still debate exactly how direct the line is between prehistoric conflict and later warfare. Human societies differ enormously across time and place. Some develop highly militarised systems, others maintain relatively lower levels of organised violence for long periods. No single explanation fully accounts for why warfare intensifies in some regions and not others, but the broader trajectory is unmistakable. Once human groups begin organising violence collectively, the capacity remains available. Civilization does not erase it. Civilization refines it. The people buried at Jebel Sahaba could not imagine armies crossing continents or cities burning under siege. They did not know kings, cavalry, or steel. Yet in their wounded bodies lies an early chapter of the same human story, a story in which survival, fear, memory, and belonging gradually merge into institutions of war powerful enough to reshape the planet itself. The First War may never be fully known, but the path from those ancient riverbank graves to the organised conflicts of later civilization is not as long as it first appears. The distance between them is measured not only in time, but in accumulation. One wound becomes many, one raid becomes tradition, one defended place becomes territory, and eventually, territory becomes. The old cemetery near the Nile does not answer every question, but it refuses to be forgotten. It remains there in the mind as a place where the deep past suddenly becomes close, almost uncomfortably close. 13,000 years is an immense distance, long enough for climates to shift, rivers to change their courses, deserts to spread, languages to vanish, and entire ways of life to disappear without names. Yet the injuries in those bones are immediately understandable. A stone point in a rib does not require translation. A healed wound does not need an inscription. A child buried among the violently dead speaks across time with a clarity that no monument can improve. This is why Jebel Sahaba matters so deeply. It is not merely old evidence of violence. It is a warning from a world before history, showing that human conflict does not begin only when people become civilized enough to record it. It begins in pressures older than writing hunger: fear, revenge, identity, territory, memory, and the need to protect those considered one's own. These pressures do not always lead to killing. Most days, in most lives, they do not. Human beings are also cooperative, adaptable, generous, inventive, and capable of astonishing care. But under certain conditions, the same bonds that hold one group together can harden against another group outside the circle. The cemetery preserves that contradiction. The dead were wounded by human hands, yet buried by human hands. The same species that made weapons also made graves. The same minds that could plan an ambush could remember the dead tenderly enough to place them into the earth. What survives in the record suggests not a simple tale of savagery, but a more troubling truth. Violence and care have always lived close together in human societies. They are not opposites belonging to different kinds of people. They are possibilities within the same human world. Calling Jebel Sahaba the first war ever fought by humans is powerful, but perhaps too final. It may be among the earliest known strong evidence for organised intergroup violence. It may represent recurring raids, a long feud, a massacre, or some combination of these. Scholars still debate the exact nature of the conflict, and the evidence remains incomplete. Somewhere older, another site may lie buried beneath floodplain silt, desert sand, jungle soil, or the sea. Many early conflicts surely left no trace at all. The true First War may be forever unreachable. But perhaps the phrase First War matters less as a fixed label than as a question. It asks when human beings first turned coordinated skill against other human beings. It asks when a group first saw another group not merely as strangers, but as enemies. It asks when fear became organised, when memory became vengeance, when a useful weapon became a social instrument of death. Jebel Sahaba does not provide every answer, but it brings the question into focus with painful force. The legacy of the site is not that humans are doomed to war. That would be too simple, and history itself contradicts it. Human groups have also survived through exchange, alliance, marriage, diplomacy, restraint, ritual settlement, and shared adaptation. Cooperation is as ancient as conflict, and probably far more necessary to survival. The people of the Nile could not have lived by violence alone. They fished, gathered, taught, healed, buried, and cared. Their world was not a battlefield at every moment. That is precisely why the violence matters. It entered a world of ordinary human life and changed it. The oldest warning, then, is not that war is inevitable. It is that war can emerge before anyone has a word for it, before institutions define it, before leaders glorify it, before scribes justify it. It can begin when landscapes tighten, when fear spreads, when grief demands repayment, when another group becomes easier to kill than to trust. The First War may have been small by later standards, but for those who lived through it, it was large enough to bury a world. And after all the debates, all the measurements, all the careful distinctions between feud, raid, massacre, and war, the final image remained simple. A river moving through a changing land, a community returning to its dead. Stone fragments hidden inside bone, survivors standing at the edge of a grave, carrying both memory and fear into whatever season came next. The river keeps moving after the last burial. It carries silt, reeds, fish, insects, fallen branches, and the reflections of people whose names are gone. It moves through drought and flood, through silence and return, through a landscape that remembers without explaining. The dead remain beneath the ground, but the world above them changes beyond recognition. The green edges withdraw, sand advances, later peoples come and go, kingdoms rise along the Nile, temples are built, armies march. Languages are spoken, carved, forgotten, translated, and forgotten again. The first wounds become part of a much longer human story. Jebel's Harbour leaves no victory, no anthem, no list of enemies, no reason carved in stone. It offers only the strange intimacy of evidence bodies buried with care, bones marked by violence, small blades that cross the boundary between survival and killing. The site does not tell us that humans are only violent. It does not tell us that peace is an illusion. It tells us something quieter and harder to dismiss, that human beings have always lived close to both tenderness and danger, and that the distance between them can narrow when fear, hunger, memory, and place begin to press too tightly together. In the end, the mystery is not only who fought the First War, it is how easily a familiar landscape can change meaning. A riverbank becomes a refuge, then a border, then a danger, then a cemetery. A tool becomes a weapon, a neighbour becomes an enemy, a wound becomes a story passed to children, a grave becomes the last trace of people who once believed their own lives were the centre of the world. And still, there is care. That is the detail that lingers. Someone buried them. Someone stayed long enough to place the dead in the earth. Someone remembered who they were. Across 13,000 years, after climate, empire, flood, and desert have done their work, that care remains beside the violence, inseparable from it. The oldest war we can glimpse is not a grand beginning. It is a shadow at the water's edge. It is a warning carried in bone. It is a reminder that civilization did not invent the human heart, with all its fear and loyalty, its grief and fury, its ability to destroy and its need to remember. The Nile flows on, indifferent and enduring, past the places where people once stood watching the reeds, where children once learned the paths to water, and where the dead still keep their silence beneath the sand.